It's my pleasure to be here today, and it's great to have this opportunity to bring so many different disciplines and perspectives together. And I didn't know we had a climate change lawyer, and I see some opportunities now, especially as someone interested in policy and communication and public opinion. And maybe we can do some research at the state level. I think that'd be great. So we'll be talking. Where did I? Okay. Uh, like our previous speaker, there's only a couple of us here at OSU that does climate change communication. And I just wanted to spend a few minutes saying, explaining at least what is climate change communication, because it is sort of a new sort of subfield of communication in general. And on the surface, you can talk about climate change educating being communication about education, providing information, warning, persuading, mobilizing. But one of the, I think the fallacies and misperceptions a lot about climate change communication is sort of a one-way flow of communication, very hierarchical, top-down, from scientist to layperson, or from scientific environmental organization to the public. And really what climate change communication is, as a field, if you look at the breadth of research and practice, is really, it's more looking at two-way communication, right? It's understanding different perspectives, values, what are the obstacles, why people are skeptical. They might have very valid reasons to do so from their perspective, from their cultural view. It's looking at underlying values and experiences that drive opinion and behavior, as well as information-seeking behaviors. It's understanding the information environment around climate change and how and what different sources, whether it's political, social, economic, or cultural, might influence that information environment. So it's very interdisciplinary, and it's really emerged in the last like 10 or 15 years. And it's it sort of started in the field of science communication, and there is a science of science communication. Actually, we have the secular colloquiums, which I recommend taking a look at online, that have been looking and bringing together all the various social scientists that look at the science of science communication. But climate change communication has actually spread and now involves like myself, people who do political communication, people who do health communication, environmental communication, psychology, environment, natural resources, even physical sciences and biophysical sciences have gotten involved in looking at communication questions, right? So it's a very interdisciplinary field. We have the School of Communication here at OSU that has a couple of communication researchers, myself and Graham Dixon, who's here with me today. And I'm going to highlight some of the research we've done in the School of Communication. But I wanted you to sort of say that the communication research, climate communication research, is well beyond even the formal field of communication, and that there are a lot of interdisciplinary opportunities to work together. Myself, I've had the opportunity to work with Robin and Erik and Elena and Brian Rowe on a couple of human natural systems project, right, looking at HABs in Lake Erie at one point. So there's a lot of opportunities for intersections looking at the role that climate change and communication plays, right? And one of the importance and reasons why climate change communication has sort of emerged is the fact that how to deal with sort of these public divide, right? So we often think of, we all understand that there's a scientific consensus on climate change. We understand about its impacts, its drivers, the ideas about mitigation and adaptation. But this is recent polling data that shows that even among the American public, there's a wide variety of perceptions about climate change. The Yale Climate Change Communication Center talks about the 6 Americas of climate change, like 6 distinct sort of populations have different views. This is sort of a breakdown from a most recent poll I could find on climate change attitudes from November 2018, where basically only only a plurality of Americans have views that are really sort of in line with the scientific consensus, right? 43%. Whereas then the other 60% have a mix of views, right? And this is actually after years and years and years and years of communication about climate change, right? And mobilization and policy discourse. And this is where we're still at, right? So we need to unpack this a little bit. And one of the critiques that a lot of us who look at climate change theory and practice is that our focus of a lot of climate change communication, both in the scientific community and among environmental, social, nonprofit, and civil society, and our politicians, has been to the converted. They've been talking to the 30% who are mobilized and interested in this topic. Well, that is great to sort of, gain some financial support, to mobilize your members, to influence the information environment. But part of climate change communication is understanding the other 60% who either are not worried, disagree, do not believe it's happening, have different cultural worldviews. And today, in practice, our climate change communication to these groups has not been effective, because often we think we're trying to convert them rather than trying to engage them, which is two different types of strategies. I just want to show, again, one reason we have such sort of policy gridlock is that this is the by congressional district. These maps and data are available from the Yale Climate Change Center, which I recommend you have not yet taken a look at. There's a lot of research, especially at the state level. They've been doing a lot of modeling, actually. And so this looks at basically those who believe that most scientists think about global warming is happening. And about half of Americans actually believe there's a scientific consensus. As you can see, by congressional district, it's usually on the coast. It's very, red state versus blue state, coast versus interior dichotomy. This geography lines up with all of our political divides, right? But you still have a minority of Americans actually believe there is a scientific consensus about human-induced anthropogenic climate change. Same, even more challenging from a communication and a behavior perspective is that only about 40% of Americans believe that climate change will impact them personally, and those are primarily on the coasts, right? The vast majority of Americans, especially in the interior, don't think there'll be any climate change impacts, right? So where you see exceptions are sort of coastal and urban areas, for the most part, most people don't think climate change will help impact them personally. Well, as we know from a risk behavior perspective, as a communication perspective, decision-making perspective, when you don't actually think a problem will impact you personally, you're not as motivated to do anything about it, right? So this is one of the communication challenges we have beyond sort of the traditional political divides that we have, or value divides we have, that we have to deal with. So these are some of the issues that we deal with from a climate change communication perspective. I just want to highlight some of the studies that have been conducted here at OSU over the last few years, give you a sense of what we've been looking at, and maybe there's intersection of some of your work, both myself and Graham. One paper that I did with several co-authors, one at the University of Michigan, sorry I mentioned that name, and one of my graduate students in Nature Climate Change. For a while, a lot of people had this perception that those who don't believe in climate change or skeptical climate change is simply an issue of education, right? It's sort of a knowledge deficit, right? It's an issue of sort of lazy thinking, right? And they're not systematically thinking about the problem, and thus, if we just sort of motivate them to think about it more deliberatively, if we educate them, we'll increase their overall knowledge, well, then they'll sort of align with the scientific consensus. Well, what we have found, not only this study, but a range of studies. There was a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science as well recently, last couple of years, that looked across a range of issues, including climate change, not specifically, is that actually there is a divide between ideology and education, that educated conservatives and educated liberals are actually have a wider gulf of perception about climate change, right? So the more you know about the issue, the more likely to actually process that information in a biased way. And this is the concept of motivated reasoning, right? The idea is that it has become very hot cognition. The idea that how we look at information is often, and how we rationalize it, is that we're sort of goal-oriented. We're working backwards, right? We're trying to basically re-rationalize how we feel about an issue, right? So in climate change, unfortunately, has become an incredibly polarized issue, right, over the last 10 or 15 years. And we can't necessarily blame the only conservatives, right? If you actually look at the discourse, the polarization started, if you look at the actual social science and political science about it, started with the Kyoto Treaty and the Clinton administration using it for political gain. You actually saw the polarization between Republicans and Democrats actually basically dramatically increase in lieu of Democratic messaging about that treaty in '97. You also saw a similar increase in 2007 when Al Gore, who is the basically poster boy for the most polarizing election of 2000, became the poster boy for climate change. Nothing else against Al Gore, but messaging it's a pendulum effect, right? So if you have Democrats and Republicans messaging on each side, it's going to increase the polarization, not reduce it, right? So some of the research we've done here is how do we cut through that? All right. How do we look at things that go beyond sort of motivated reasoning? We identify motivated reasoning and sort of polarization as one communication challenge. Some of our research tries to look beyond that in different ways. All right. Another aspect that we look at is not only how we process information or bias process information, but values and ideology also drive what information sources we look at. And so this is a paper recently, A Public Understanding of Science, that we published looking at cultural cognition that has been promoted and developed by Dan Kahan at Yale, right? And that people have different sort of hierarchical versus egalitarian views versus individual versus communitarian worldviews, and that these worldviews were sort of separate from political ideology. And so above and beyond ideology, these sort of cultural cognitions also drive our perceptions about risk and environmental impacts, right? Also in the law school. But here we try to look at sort of left-leaning versus right-leaning sort of media networks, right, and information sources, mass media, how cultural worldviews not only derive selective perception into certain media sources of information, but even then when we watch that, they also bias how we actually watch that information, right? So basically, values and ideology can actually bias our decision-making at two levels, both with information sources we attune to, but also then once we're exposed to that information, how we evaluate it, right? And so in this study, we looked at climate change concern as a dependent variable, and one of the things a couple of things came out. One, selective exposure has a large impact on climate change concern across cultural divides. So if you actually have people who are more skeptical of climate change or have values that tend to be more skeptical of climate change, if they actually are exposed to left-leaning information sources, there's a convergence, right? It actually there's in the direction of the valence of that content, right? So content we can actually drive people from the left or the right. If we can actually get them exposed to that information, we will have some type of positive effects on influencing climate change concern. However, even though when they process that information, there is some biases. So I'm running out of time, so I just want to talk about a couple other studies. One, we found that boomerang effects. This is a key study that had a nice impact that basically found that a lot of climate change communication often focuses on, at least the early communication, focuses on distal impacts. For example, if we talk to an audience about how climate change might impact Bangladesh, for example, what we found in the study here, where we're trying to simulate the same type of discourse, is that actually Republicans became more skeptical of climate change. There was a boomerang effect, right? They actually use their values and ideology to process information about distal impacts in a way that reinforces the idea that we should be less concerned and not engage in climate mitigation. This is not impacting us. So the key thing is that we can through our messaging sometimes, actually have the opposite effect of what we intend, especially when we talk about impacts that are socially or geographically distant, all right? Graham has done some research that sort of builds upon this, looking at natural hazards, right? And a lot of discourses try to link certain types of natural hazards, wildfires or hurricanes, to climate change, right, in some way. Well, what we found is that when you do that, you actually increase, through message resistance, reactance. People, again, have this sort of affective, cognitive reactance to information that is dissonant from their values or ideology. The way they deal with that affect is think that this hazard you're talking about is less severe than it actually is, right? So if you talk about linking climate change to wildfires, all right, among climate change skeptics, they're going to actually downplay the impact of that wildfire, all right, how severe it was or the risk from it. I mean, actually, we see some of that discourse. If you think about Trump and some of the discourse about the campfire in California and the reaction against linking it to climate change, you actually saw that in play, right? And lastly, I would say another type of research we've done at OSU is looking at this debate that Graham has done, looking at this debate between target and consensus messaging. There is one school of thought that says, okay, we just need to hammer to the American public that 97% of scientists agree, and that might be a gateway to influencing climate skeptics to accept climate change is happening and accept climate mitigation policy. Well, the opposite is to do what we call target messaging, to frame and talk about climate change mitigation in ways that resonate with the values and ideology held by climate skeptics. For example, talking about free market solutions to dealing with climate change, right? Or technology that might not alienate them in terms of values and ideology. These are two different messaging strategies. Graham tested this and found that actually it was target messaging, free market solutions that was much more effective than consensus messaging. And that consensus messaging really didn't actually drive any type of attitude change on this topic. So it's sort of contributing to this debate about how we go about effectively influencing attitudes about climate mitigation. I just want to end with two things. One, that Graham and I have to be resources for you when it comes to talking about climate change, collaborating about climate change, communicating to especially the general public or the lay public about climate change policy. But we also do work on adaptation and resilience as well. And we also do work and have interest when it comes to public acceptance of emerging technologies like CO2 capture or even promotion of nuclear as alternatives to fossil fuels. So that's some of the areas that we're developing in terms of moving forward. But there are also some resources that I recommend to you that are outside of OSU in terms of a recent report on how to communicate science effectively from the National Academies of Science Education, Engineering and Medicine. George Mason has a Center on Climate Change Communication in Yale as well. And there's lots of data reports there that you can use for your own purposes. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.